Welcome to Bards and Barrels, the podcast for Dungeons & Dragons players, new and old. I'm Phil Boone, and I'm joined by my friends and co-hosts, Ross Struess and Brett Miller. We'll be exploring the world of Dungeons & Dragons in each episode, sharing our experiences, offering tips and advice for those who play and run this classic game. So whether you're a new player just starting out or a seasoned veteran looking to get a new perspective on things, Bards and Barrels has something for everyone. So sit back, grab a drink, and join us as we roll for initiative and embark on an epic adventure. There it is, the opening crack. Welcome back, fellas. Welcome back. Phil, Brett, and Ross here in the studio tonight, and we are coming at you in Season 2 here with the second part of our series on DMing.
It's a small little nugget, so we had to break it up.
A small
That's
nugget.
An understatement. Understatement of the season right there.
So if you guys have been listening along with us throughout our journey here, we hit on in the first season a little bit about a session 0, but we hit that kind of from a player's perspective and sort of a what is it type of scenario. We kind of want to help you approach this as a DM tonight and talk about how would you run a session 0?
So I think you're going to hear a lot of the same things that we talked about in that episode, at least to start. And one of those, and I think it's almost crucially important now, like looking back, especially if you don't know your party, is that survey that we had from that episode. We'll share that again on this episode when we post it on Facebook. That way everybody can take a look. But it's just a way for you to get to know your party, because that's really what a session 0 is about. So it's like building some rapport with your party, getting to know them, they get to know you, because this is going to lay the foundation for everything moving forward.
Ross, you bring up a good point talking about the survey. So we've talked about that tool before and how useful that is. On the DM side of the table, when you get ready for a session 0, what kind of prep work have you guys done?
You know, you have to do a little prep before a session 0 based on your campaign, but not a ton. I mean, it's helpful to at least read. If it's a short running campaign, read the whole thing once. Just skim through it real quick. So you have somewhat of an idea of where in the world this thing is going. But if it's a long campaign, read the first little bit section maybe. So you have somewhat of an idea of how to introduce it to your players as you get started.
So I do think if you're like a long time DM, it's going to boil down to personal preference. You're probably going to have a session 0 when you start every campaign. Talking about the campaign itself, I would completely, like if you're doing a pre-built, pre-printed campaign from Wizards, I'm probably reading through the entire thing. So by the time we hit session 0, I know the whole thing. If it's new players and I have to do more guiding for them, probably still going to read it ahead of time, but I could see also where you're just going to know like the first little bit, or if it's your first time DMing, which this is really who this is for, you're probably not going to have gone through the entire thing and understand it anyway.
Yeah, I fall in that same camp as you, Ross. I typically try to read through the whole thing, and I guess that is not a requirement. Like, I for sure want to like put that out there, but one of the reasons that I do is that we like to do character creation, or want to encourage character creation, or at least tying backstories in, creating relationships between party members during a session 0. And the more you know about the campaign, the more you can try to tie stories into locations or deities, or just different pieces of the adventure. Obviously not a requirement, but that's why I tend to try to read the entire adventure.
And I think you don't have to be too detailed on knowing every specific thing.
No.
But if you know where the campaign's going and know those small details of, okay, this thing is really important, don't necessarily mess that up with character creation, and leave the rest of it open-ended for your players to plug in and fit into that campaign.
So I think one of the things I want you guys to share a little bit about is this campaign that we are joining one of our friends, Matt, with, is a space campaign. So the importance of that session 0.
Oh.
Yes.
It's a different type of campaign.
Yes. And I think that goes back to like having like in this case, Matt knowing he had run it once, so that was a big help for him because he was able to kind of give us the gist of these are the things you need to know. For example, we didn't know if we could breathe in space. We didn't know that there were a bubble around. There's like essentially a bubble of air or a bubble of magic around the ship that allows you to breathe if you fall off the ship. Like those are things you need to know.
Like gravity around the ship
Yes.
is relative, and you come back to the ship for a little bit.
Right.
Like all sorts of weird things that we had no idea about, and that was great just to get us into the mechanics of that campaign.
Yeah, mechanics and backstory too, right? Like you're in
Yes.
space, where's your character from? Because we're so used to finding somewhere in Faerun that our characters are from. It doesn't really apply. It could, but
Right. And I think that kind of leads to if this is your first time DMing, maybe don't choose something that has a lot of quirks to it. D&D in space, although it sounds really freaking cool, I would still highly suggest you start with
yeah.
the essentials kit or the starter kit, just because it's just going to be that you're in the woods, you're fighting some goblins or something like that. You're not going to have to worry about like space guppies and things like that, or fighting vampires. Like they're like, it's not just D&D in space, but there's things like in Ravenloft or
the Eberron campaign
that's
setting.
the one I was going to say
Yeah.
just now too. Yeah, it was like there's a lot of quirks where it's like if you really want to dive into that, fine. I would read the whole book before you do that, so you know those quirks. But if you're not quite ready for that, keep it simple.
Because you can rely on your experience probably having watched Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. A lot of those medieval shows set you up for having a pretty good background to know how to DM a medieval type campaign.
And if you're going to look for content too, there's just more content readily available
Yeah.
using that just in general too. So one of the other pieces of a session zero that I think will kind of lead us into the next area here too is getting to know how your party plays, what people's interests are. Sure, some of that comes up in character creation, but what are other ways you can kind of figure that out about your party?
Well, I think you hit the main one. So it's like if you know the type of person they are, and you're probably going to have a general idea of the type of character they are. I like to talk a lot. I tend to play characters with high charisma. Go figure, right? So it's like if you know that about a person, you can help lead them in a direction where they're going to end up playing a character that they really like. The caveat here is like you should also encourage players to like get out of that a little bit. Right now, I'm playing a Hadazee rogue that is not my favorite. Like he has a great backstory and I enjoy playing like him and his personality, but a rogue is not for me. And that's what I'm finding out, but that's okay because I'm trying something different, right?
The session zero also is a great time to figure out what the players want from the campaign. And that could be like the social encounters, the combat, all those things. But also, how long do they realistically think they can be a part of this campaign?
True.
Because if some of the players are only wanting to do it 2 or 3 sessions or like once a month, and other people want to do once or twice a week, every month for a year, those are very different campaigns.
Absolutely. And I would say like when you're asking them like, what do you want out of the campaign? Like you were talking about, do you want social interactions or do you want this to be combat heavy? I would say take that with a grain of salt. Obviously, you want to start that way because that's what they initially want. But I think the three of us are a prime example of we always thought we were going to be a combat heavy. We wanted to go in and swing swords. And after you play for a while, you start leaning toward those not social experiments, but those social interactions. That's right. But the point is like being flexible to do that with your party. Like even though they start out saying combat, don't think you're going to stick to that the whole way kind of thing.
No, but it's a great way to get their feet wet into the campaign.
For sure.
Learn their characters a little bit as you first get started.
And that's how you're going to get going. Like once they get their feet wet, you get your feet wet, you're going to kind of settle into a flow and like you'll know how they want to do things, and then you'll find that back and forth.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. One of the pieces I like to interject into a session 02 as a DM are some what do you want to call them, nuggets about the campaign, right? Almost a hook, not necessarily a hook, but there are certain truths sometimes that just need to be known about a campaign. Like kind of looking back to the Descent to Avernus campaign that we played, I feel like if I would go back and do that session 0 again, it would probably look a little different because I don't think we necessarily talked a lot about how 98% 8% of the campaign was going to take place in the Nine Hells.
Yeah.
And it could have influenced some character decisions, possibly, at least minusculely, but some of the, how do things work in the Nine Hells, like all of those pieces, I think I probably would have given a little bit more away than what I did initially.
I do think, like, in that particular instance, again, this is going to become from knowing your party. Once you get into it a ways, it's like you created a character for the campaign that you're doing, like sharing things that they, like, Ari being a fire genie was not great in the Nine Hells. You couldn't do a whole lot of damage.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Thorn, Paladin, doing radiant damage did some work, right? But the good news in our case was, like, we got to a certain point where we knew we wanted to keep this going. So that decision seems a lot more minuscule now because we're going to go beyond the Nine Hells. So it's like when you start this, like, yes, give them the information to do their character creation, especially if you think this is going to be a one campaign and that we're going to create new characters and go to a different campaign. But if you think there's ever a chance that this will expand beyond that, that's where that freedom comes in. Like, let them do what they want. Share with them. They make the final decision.
And, having the players know some of what's going to happen in your campaign can really help their backstories develop in a way that fits the campaign and you can pull from better. So, like, we were running Storm King's Thunder, and that's heavily focused on giants. With a little bit of background knowledge, you can have your characters have maybe they have some sort of history with the giants. Maybe one of the giants stomped through their village or killed their family, or whatever. But then that leads to having a crutch to get them into the story, and you have an easier flow getting started.
Well, it makes for more almost playable NPCs as well, because at some point in that campaign, they may come up against that giant. Like in the space campaign that we're playing with Matt, he did that with my character in the side quest that Brett and I did one episode. It was very much based on what I'd put in my background story. So just having things to be able to tie in like that can come out of giving some of those details up front.
I think that plays well into our tailoring to your experience too.
Yeah.
And going off of the Lyzaraxis campaign we're doing, it's like Isaac and I having two characters that have known each other. Like, we came up with a lot of that backstory before we ever started. And so like my Hadazi, and he has I'm going to mess this up and he's going to be mad at me. A GIF. I think he says GIF. I don't know if it's GIF. It's one of the two. I don't know now. I'm
you're
sorry.
Gonna pay if you're wrong.
I'm sorry, Murgy. Please forgive me. But Rhodey, who's my character, and Murgy, who is Isaac, like, we had this cool thing where, like, they were in prison together and they have a ship together. So I was like, we came up with all of that in session 0.
Had
a ship. The Don John has taken the proverbial trip, unfortunately. So, yeah.
Well, before we transition into how to run just any other session, do you guys have any final thoughts on session 0?
I would say there's a lot of resources out there of tips and tricks for running a session 0. Just spend some time looking up information. It'll give you a framework of what to walk through, some tips and tricks, and you don't have to do all of it. There's a lot of them recommend you do a lot. You don't necessarily have to do all of them. Feel out what feels best for you, and just try.
I think one of the things you'll figure out in session 0, and we may have hit on this a little bit, was like, are you going to meet virtually? Are you going to meet in person?
Yeah.
So it's like
logistics,
right? Exactly. So it's like, if you're going to meet virtually, like, you need to know, D&D Beyond is slowly working their way toward a new virtual tabletop, right? They've just come out with the alpha version of Maps, which certainly feels like we're heading down that road. But it's like, are you going to play there? Are you going to play in Roll20? Are you going to play in Foundry? I think it's called Foundry. It's like there's all these places you can play. You got to work that out and know how they work before you hit session 1.
And does everybody have a computer to do different ones? But are you going to do it in person and can just maybe run off of a phone? Like, there's lots of little ways that you can do different things, but you need to know what your players can handle.
Right. And I think another thing that we haven't hit on yet is, like, when we were talking about in season 1, like, things from a player perspective, like, we always centered that around, you could do this with the basic rules. You don't need any of the books. I would say the flip side of that, as a DM, it would benefit you greatly to have a copy of the core rule books. So the player's handbook, the dungeon master guide, and the monster manual,
would
just as a
agree.
way to get started, because it just gives the availability of all the information to you. So if you don't know something, you do have the ability to go find it. It's not that you can't Google it, but it's nice to have that book right in front of you and be able to look up those things.
I will say too, to the Dungeon Master's Guide especially, there's tables in there for like magical items and descriptions and all of that, which is very helpful if you're trying to describe something to players.
So here's the thing with the Dungeon Master Guide. So unlike the Player's Handbook, where it's like it takes you step A to B, like here's how you create a character, here's how you do the basics of the game and things like that. It's not overly intimidating. There's a lot there, but it's not overly intimidating. The Dungeons Master's Guide is very intimidating because it starts out the very first, and Phil and I were talking earlier, like we don't know why they structured this book this way, but they start out with world building. So if you're going through part 1 and it's talking about here's all the planes that exist that may have nothing to do with the story you're running.
Deities.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
All your deities, which you may have one player that has a deity that you need to know about, but it's going to give you tables and tell you about all these deities. You don't need any of that. Well, you may need pieces of that, but you likely don't need most of it. And so you don't even really get into like how do you run the adventure and you know, playing NPCs until you get into the second part of the book. So if you're reading through chapter 1, you're like, oh, I'm ready to do this. And you're like, crap, I'm not ready to do this anymore. It's very easy to get intimidated.
And so much of being a DM is just accumulating knowledge and resources over time. One of the things I like to do is save resources on Instagram or Facebook or wherever of tips and tricks from other DMs on how to store information and have it readily available. Like having a OneNote and having different tabs with like generic character names or locations or tavern names. Having those handy and you can just grab one and put it in when you need it without having to make up Bob's Tavern
right
every third tavern.
I hear there's good beer at Bob's. So
that might be available
Bob always has
with
good
our
beer.
Nick's opening
Bob's
crack.
Best Brew, baby.
Bob's, yes.
Well, I know. So one of the future episodes that we're going to do is a lot about tools, right? We want to hit on some of those things that you can really use to make your life easier, to bring additional features to your game. And I think we can highlight some of those tools as well. I know what I forgot about Session 0 is the teaser.
Yes.
At the end of a Session 0, you have to play a little. Like, everybody wants to roll those math rocks. Right?
It gets
Hashtag math rocks.
yes. It gets your players so like they're just like chomping at the bit, ready to start playing, and it gets them going. And then they get excited about it. They leave the table and go work on their character more.
I mean, you may have spent 4 hours up to this point talking about nuggets and building characters. It's like, I want to do something. I don't want to stop and then wait a week or even till tomorrow before I get to do something with this.
So, Phil, how much of a teaser would you actually give?
I like to. I guess I fall into a trope. I like combat as far as a teaser goes. So typically that's a good way to start because it lets people kind of explore some of the features of their character too, though, to kind of learn what their basic weapons are or, you know, cantrips. That's probably where I would start. But, I think there's plenty of use cases to start with a social scenario of, you have some sort of a patron or something like that the group is going to and they're getting orders or, there's a capture scene or a chase scene. There are a lot of different options. I think Descent had something. It was that weird secret. Do you guys even remember
I
it?
do remember that.
Because it was kind of garbage. So we basically tossed it out and never talked about it again. But you're criminals. You did something.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
like part of a coup or something.
And somebody knew your secret.
Yeah.
And yeah, like that. I wouldn't do that one. That
Guess
wasn't
what?
very
That
good.
mother trucker never showed up.
It was the Duke. You
Oh,
killed
well,
her.
it didn't matter.
So-
She was gone.
Exactly.
She gone.
We talked about that in the Descent to
it
Avernus.
didn't
Oh, I think we
matter.
did. You're right. I would say if you're a little intimidated about doing like something at the end of that first session, take a deep breath. It's going to be okay because, like you said, Phil, a lot of the pre-written campaigns typically have a hook or something at the beginning to help you get through that. So you're basically running that campaign hook at the end of your session 0 instead of the beginning of session 1.
One of the reasons I think it's really important too is I think I speak for all three of us that we enjoy creating characters, but that's not everyone else's favorite thing always. So if you did spend like 2 hours creating characters, you need to kind of give someone else a chance to do more than just create a character. So
I agree with that. But before we move on to the next thing, I do have like a question for you, because being a DM is like the cornerstone of having a session. Can't really have one if you don't have a DM. What would you guys say to people who are out there who are on the fence about doing it? And I'm going to look at Brett, because you've DM'd the least of us. And so, like, if somebody's super intimidated, doesn't want to try it, what would you tell them?
I would say you've got to just put yourself out there and try it. You don't have to commit to a full long-term campaign. Try it and see what skills you have at it and where you maybe need to develop some skills or practice a little bit more. And just put yourself out there.
I think if you have been a long time player, I would tell you, you know more than you think you know.
Yes.
Because I think that's a barrier for a lot of people. And we talked about this, I think we mentioned it in the last episode, was like, you're not Matt Mercer, and that's fine from Critical Role, right? It's like, you don't need to know everything. So my suggestion would be, you know more than you think you do. Find somebody to help guide you a little bit. Like, have a former DM in your party who you can look at and be like, did I do that right? Or they can be like, hey, you have a good relationship where they can go, hey, do this next time, because that will help you just keep you organized and it'll make more sense. And that's how you do that.
And also ask your players for feedback, especially those former DMs. Ask them for feedback afterwards. I feel I know you did that when we first got started. Like, how did that session go? What did you think of it?
I still probably should, to be honest. Like at this point, like
Sure.
Instead you kind of fall into patterns. But yeah, you're right. And Matt's been doing it. He messages me sometimes after those sessions too, just to see how they went. And yeah, I think that's the best way to learn. And I think you're right. If you're in a party and you offer to your DM that you are interested in DMing like a one shot or a couple sessions or something like that, I highly doubt they're going to turn you down. I'm sure they would take the opportunity for a couple week break.
For sure. Anyway, I just thank you guys for entertaining me.
Yeah.
Because I thought that was like an important thing to like let everybody out there know, is like there are some just mental barriers for some people to like make that jump from being the player to running the game.
So one thing too I want to just interject into it is, you know what, worst case scenario, you crash and burn. But at the end of the day, as long as you had fun and the players at your table had fun, who cares about the rest? Honestly, like the rules are meant to be broken. If everyone's having a good time and there's still, some sort of structure, even if it's not in the rule book, it doesn't matter.
And the chances are your players are going to remember their character and kind of the goofiness of what happened in that thing more than a little flub you made.
Absolutely. And this is going to be the third time we've said this on an episode of Bards and Barrels. But there's that line at the beginning of the Dungeon Master's Manual that says that the rules are there as guidelines. So it doesn't matter. Go into it. Have fun with it. The D&D gods are not going to smite you if you do a rule slightly different than it's supposed to be. It doesn't matter. Just have fun doing it.
Your players don't know the story. Only you do.
Exactly.
All right. Well, I think that will probably wrap us for a session 0. Let's talk about any regular week session. Session 1 plus.
Mm-hmm.
What does that kind of look like for the DM? Like, we can talk prep a little bit if you think you want to talk that route, or even running the session. What does combat look like? I mean, there's a lot in this part, and I'm not sure we can even unpack it all in one episode, but running a session.
I think we need to talk about prep first.
Okay.
Because everybody's going to be like, I'm going to read the next 30 pages of the campaign that I'm running because I need to know that stuff because that's what's going to happen.
So guilty.
And Phil, tell us, how big of a mistake is that?
It's a mistake every time I do it. I've done it so many times because you make it through like 2 pages because party is always just, it's a free will game. So it doesn't matter. You can read the 30 pages to be prepped. Sometimes it's helpful in case, you skip like 25 pages, but
sometimes you just smash walls down and go through a dungeon sideways.
Yeah.
Save you some time, even though you read all of that for mostly nothing.
It's fine.
It's all good, right? Yeah. So This does tie back into something we talked about a little earlier, though, was like if you had read a considerable amount of your campaign or even the entire thing, you know the gist of this storyline already. So
Yes.
typically what I will do, because I know, having probably written the recap, I asterisk on that because sometimes the recap doesn't happen and I have to rely on players to tell me what the hell we did. But I generally know where you're at in the story. So my prep is going to be from here, there's 3 possible ways you're going to take this. And there's always the 4th way that could be completely off the rails. So my job would be I need to at least have an idea of what those 3 ways are and then have something in mind in case you go completely a different direction. That's my prep.
The way that I've kind of started taking that on at the bookstore here in town for the campaign that we're running is just to use like a note card. And it has basically an outline, right? Of, hey, this is kind of the order that I suspect things are going. And that's all I have on it. And then everything outside of that, I might have read through, so I'm familiar with it. But then I just sort of know, okay, like we're here, we're going to go here. Oh, they're not headed that direction, right? Like that's probably out. It just helps me keep, I don't know, structured throughout it and can keep me on track well enough to know where things are going.
I would say if you are the kind of person that feels like you need to read a chunk just to know like all the possible outcomes based on where you're at in a story, that's fine. If that's how you want to do things, do it. Just know that most of the time 3 to 4 hours of prep is not necessarily required. If you're doing homebrew and you have to write some things, that's a little different. But if we're talking running a pre-written campaign, an hour's worth of checking things is probably plenty most of the time.
And if you read it through once, you're probably good. And then you just do that hour.
Right. And a lot of it boils down to, it's like when I read through it, case in point, and you guys didn't hear me say this, but like in the Curse of Strahd book, when I read through it the first time, I did not read hardly anything about Castle Ravenloft because that's literally the end game. There's a lot of things in that story that will keep you from doing that until the end. So it's like glazed over that because I don't need that until we get a little bit farther down the road.
That's what I did in Descent as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it did become pivotal at the end to read that chapter like a couple of times. Like there are key moments, right, that things build to. And that I think is different. That might take a little more prep. But to your point, like that's the end game. Like if we get to that point, we got to know, and there are tons of different options that it can lead to. So you just have to be a little more prepared in those instances.
And you do have to remember, there may be an entire chapter in a book dedicated to one event that's going to happen, but a good dice roll means 90% of that chapter didn't happen. Already rolling amazing charisma rolls, persuasion rolls, and everything. So it's like that's just how the game works. So you got to be a little flexible and roll with the punches, roll with the dice, so to speak.
I see what you did.
There it is.
Thank you. Take a bow. Take a bow.
So in addition to prep, running a session, let's just kind of talk through rough outline of maybe what a session would look like or a recent session that we've played.
So obviously step 1, gather your players if they're not already gathered. As a DM, if you're playing in person, you're probably doing a little setup for yourself with the screen. Make sure you have something to take notes on, have pertinent books in front of you, probably a laptop.
One of the fun things that we've started doing is every week we do something that we picked up from Dungeons and Daddies, another podcast that you should listen to, but is we give a random fact about our character. So it continues to build the backstory that we started with and keep layering in new nuggets of our characters as players, or potentially even a key NPC could have additional nuggets.
So one thing I have done different, and we've only done one of these, and I think you're the only one that's answered me. But instead of asking for a fun fact, I just asked a question. Like I wanted to know for your guys' characters in the campaign we're running, what is the thing you're most afraid of?
Oh yeah.
So it's like the facts give you backstory for you to play with. The questions give me something as a DM that I can play with.
I like that idea better because when you just give the players the free range to make up fun facts, you never know what the hell you're going to have to incorporate into your campaign.
That's how you end up with awesome magical items.
Min Maxers over here trying to take over the world. Ross.
Hey, it's fine. I just told Phil I had it and he agreed. It's fine. He let me have it.
Week after week.
It wasn't that bad. But hey,
it was more than once, but it's fine.
But then after our fun facts, we get into a recap of what happened last time. And that sometimes is done by the DM, but sometimes they pass it off to a player and say, "What do you remember from last time? Can you give us a recap of what happened?" And that's also interesting to see the balance between what the DM knows is important and what the players think is important.
I think giving another shout out to Dungeons and Daddies, I always thought something that would be fun would be like if you as a character had to read like a journal entry that like recap. So it's like you're not just
Your
saying what
diary.
happened, but you're saying it from the perspective of your character. And some of that happens in Dungeons and Daddies when they do their recap. They do it in very pop culture ways, which is great. But I think it would be really cool, like if it's like almost like you're hearing the internal dialogue of one of your players, like how they saw the last session happen.
That's fun.
It would be really fun too for someone that failed a bunch of like perception checks because there was like,
God.
Oh, yes.
everyone else did some stuff and I was emptying my pockets.
Dear diary, yesterday sucked.
Like from Critical Role, if you just had Grog repeating something of what happened the previous day, oh man,
It would-
oh that'd be so good.
It would take 3 hours to get through it.
Probably.
After Asterisk got fell in the sticks.
Yeah. And his memory wiped for a
I
day.
don't remember much of yesterday.
I would suggest as a DM, it's fun to do that. If you're gonna do that and ask your players to recap your sessions, give them a heads up. 'Cause not everyone takes
Yes.
notes, and not everyone needs to take notes.
Especially if it's been a couple weeks.
Yeah,
It can get a little rough, I can tell you from experience.
even as a DM, sitting down to write a recap after a couple weeks can be a little rough. So
Yeah.
my recommendation, if you're gonna write recaps, would be to do it the next day or even that night if it's not already midnight.
Yeah. I think I did. I have not written the recap.
Ah,
guys.
dang.
Oh no!
There's notes somewhere. Hopefully, I can find those.
That got
Hashtag
nuts.
don't do what Ross does.
Well, I definitely crit hit that monster and killed it in one shot.
I believe it. I don't remember there being a monster, but sure, I believe it. Why not? I don't know the difference.
Well, I think that will take us basically up to gameplay. So I think that's a good time to stop today, and we'll save the rest of this DM topic.
Breaking it up to section 3.
I think we've got to. So we'll push this out to our third session on DMing, and you'll hear that one in a couple of weeks. That's going to do it for this episode of Bards and Barrels. You can listen to past episodes of the show anywhere podcasts can be found. Want to stay in the loop and not miss the latest from us? Be sure to head over and give us a like and a follow on Facebook or Instagram at Bards and Barrels. We'll see you soon.